Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Well, thank you very much. Thank everybody for coming today. If I'm a little slow, it's because it's very early in the morning where I am. We've all been in the security industry a long time. We know how many weaknesses there are. We know that we're missing globally somewhere between 2 and 3 million people for the skills that are needed over the coming years. And so in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a lot of the skills that I believe are needed as the industry, the security industry, changes over time. And as the world changes and our technologies change, our security knowledge base for the security workers today and in the future is changing desperately. So I want to put this in a little bit of context with the way that I grew up. And I grew up, let's see, is this button going to work? I grew up as an analog engineer. My mother was an analog engineer at NBC. My father helped develop radar during World War II. So I'm an engineering family. I used to go to DEF CON. Well, I still go to DEF CON, and that shows that lifelong history of it. I used to fix TVs as a little kid because it was pretty easy to do. And TVs were new technology. And I figured out, oh, you remove the tubes, put them in, test them down at the drugstore, and you can make 50 cents. And that was not a bad way to make a living. This is what electronics stores used to look like back in my day when we had to build things from scratch, sort of the equivalent of today's DIYers, do-it-yourselfers. I built my first computer, not that it was very hard, when I was 9 years old, and it was an analog computer. So those of you familiar with some of my work in analog, you'll appreciate that. It's kind of going home for me. A high school computer, started on DECs and IBMs. I was never very good at programming, but I somehow got through it all. I wanted to get a job after high school, and the two biggest places to work were Bell Labs and IBM. Bell Labs wouldn't hire me because I was colorblind. I couldn't tell the difference in the colors of all those wires. And at IBM wouldn't hire me because they wanted me to look like the guy on the right, Ross Perot, who unfortunately he did die yesterday. So best wishes to his family. But I could not, as a 17-year-old in good faith, go to work there. So I went into the music business, and that's where my father and my mother came from. So it was very natural for me. Now, one thing that you notice here in the rear is what we call a patch bay. And up on the right second wall next to the tape machine, those are pinboard matrices. And that's how everything got glued together. And I had this native ability to understand systems in the analog realm. It really wasn't taught to me. It's just something that I understood how things got put together and glued together. So it was a natural fit for me. I used to make records. For those of you that understand vinyl, vinyl used to be cut on devices like this, and it was a system of analog audio engineering and mechanical systems to build the masters by which vinyl was cut. I worked on very complex systems with Jimi Hendrix and Moog back in the early days of electronic and synthesis. So my education was a lot different than what a lot of people do today in terms of preparing themselves for an industry. I built this computer. It was the machine language programming on the input. And again, I was awful, absolutely horrendous at it. But at least I was able to build it and say, okay, it worked, next. In our day, we had to synchronize audio and video using some pretty bizarre techniques so we could broadcast on television. And these were some of the devices we used to use. And when everything broke, we would have to manually, by hand, adjust the speed of the motors in the systems so that the audio and the video would properly synchronize. And there were techniques for doing this, and it was called following the Lissajous pattern. And we would have to spend literally days with our hands on knobs just to make sure that the voice or the hi-hat or the drum or whatever instrument synchronized properly with the video that we were seeing. And this was the way we used to do it. It was no other way. I started finally getting into my own computers and my business way back in the late 70s. And again, not a great programmer, somehow got through and made it work and was able to run the business on it. So digital automation then decided to hit the audio industry. And that's where I ultimately met my wife. And the big console, all audio, everything was great. But on the right there, that little box was a computer that never worked, that was supposed to automate all of the audio in the studios for broadcast and for movies. Epic fail, epic fail. So we disconnected that and just ran everything by hand. This was one of my studios that we had in New York, and again, all analog. And then I decided I'm going to go become a security expert. And if that sounds weird, it should, because I had no basis for it whatsoever. The NSA had just put out the Orange Book, sort of a guideline as to how to secure things. I had no degrees in this, no certificates. Nobody really did. But I was compelled to investigate security because it was very cool technology, and I had spent my prior career just fooling around with technology. And so this really got me interested. So in the early days, I was interested in the weaponization of the internet, and that's why I wrote the novel Terminal Compromise, which became finally Die Hard 4, the movie. Information warfare was the one that showed governments how to wage war in cyberspace. And a lot of what we're seeing these days came out of those early books that I'd written on how to have conflict, non-physical, non-kinetic conflict in cyberspace, such as we understood it in those days. And unfortunately, most of it has come true. So then I was testifying before Congress talking about an electronic Pearl Harbor coming, and that was back in 1991. So I was very heavily involved in how to turn all of these systems and viruses and software. How can we turn them all into weapon systems? And even though I had, at this point, less than 10 years experience, I was thinking things and talking about things that were very unpopular at the time. So throughout the years, I kept going on that and decided we really need to fix this. This is so awful. This is so bad. We really need to do something. And so a lot of work over the next 20 years on trying to figure out how can we go about fixing this. And at the end of the presentation, there will be a brief, crass commercial pitch for how we think we've done that. So my real goal was I wanted to figure out how can we prove security? Is it possible to do? And a lot of people say, no, you cannot prove it. But now we do have the mathematics behind it. But that isn't really helping us yet with what do we need from the next generation of people coming into the industry. So in the looking at the future of what we need, one of the things that we certainly are missing is the concept of education. And education is right now, can you configure a firewall? Good. Can you code a Python script? Sure. Those are fairly simple concepts that are very vertical, useful skills, but by themselves, they're certainly not enough, because we are moving into this world of cyber, physical, and people all tied together. And I call this the anthro-cyber-kinetic conflation of all of the domains in which we live. All of the domains that are concerned with cybersecurity are all coming together right now. And as we look at the needs of the industry in the coming months and years, we need to address more of the realities of what is needed. And I have noticed over the years giving talks of how much we are really missing the point. So back almost 10 years ago, the DHS secretary said, we can't find people. And I say, that's bullshit. What you can't is find, the government cannot find the people that fit their mold of what a cybersecurity person should be in their minds. And we all know suits, people that are wear the three-piece suit or dress very nicely, go to the office and do their job. And we also know the other portion of cybersecurity experts are the people that act different, look different, behave different. Some might call them the white hat hacker community. But there's a big difference between them. And unfortunately, those white hat hackers still are having a huge amount of time getting involved into mainstream security practices. We find that there's a lot of arbitrary discrimination going on within human resources in the hiring process. Are you young enough? Are you old enough? Are you too old? Right now, I'm too old to get a job. By all means, I can consult, but I could never get a job. Sex discrimination is certainly much more prevalent here in the United States than it is in other places. But all of these things and criteria say what Napolitano wanted was quote unquote normal. But is that really what we need in the skill sets of the future? Do we need, oops, my bad. Do we need normal? So when we look at our security problems, no matter what world we're in or what piece of the industry, I argue that every single one of these that's on your slide right now are the same. They have the same fundamental anthro-cyber-kinetic, that's human, physical, and cyber components. And we need to be a little bit more flexible with the way that we look at things and train people to be able to speak all of these various languages, because that is the nature of the future. So in order to get quote unquote the right stuff, the right people in it, I'm arguing that we need an additional set of skill sets added into the curriculums from the schools, from extra training on the job, additional training credits at conferences. And it comes down to three fundamental areas, which hopefully will give people a bigger picture of the general, the strategic look at things versus the very small tactical or surgical type of approaches we often take today. We all know people that say, I know how to run a Splunk SIM, but I can't run the Cisco configuration router in their iOS. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? It doesn't matter, because what we need is a different level of language for everybody to talk. And I want to begin with engineering. One of the things in our field is, oh, how successful have you been? Well, in the real engineering world, it's how many mistakes have you made and how much have you learned from those mistakes so that you don't repeat them. That is not something we do in our field, and it's to our detriment, because we all know how many times have we said it to ourselves or to our friends, this is the same old thing all over again. And I've been saying it, I know, for now almost 40 years. Do we teach basic logic in Boolean? That is very, very important. In truth table, in logic, in planning systems, very, very important. However, we tend to avoid it because we look at the logic of a system after we have built it, not before we have built it. And looking at logic in this way is critical to understanding how security really works. Do we teach the basics of mechanical engineering? Well, the bridge up there that was built in the 1940s, and after a couple of weeks, a windstorm came along. It had been built poorly. It went into chaos mode and collapsed. 3D printers, soldering, basic mechanical tools, and understanding of how these systems work. If you're designing cyber for a mechanical system, I argue you should have a pretty good idea as to how those mechanical systems work and at what point will they go out of control. It's about failure mode, and we do not design or consider the world in terms of failure in cybersecurity. In the mechanical world, that is almost number one. Basic electrical, these are networks. All of these are networks, and the concept of network applies all over the world of engineering. Yet in our world, we think of network as just being a couple computers talking to each other over TCP/IP. And in reality, networks are any system that has an input and an output and some degree of variable control over it. Once you get the concept of networks, you can apply them all over. And the next one is taking them into the analog realm. Everything is not always a zero, not always a one. There are plenty of places, in fact, an infinity of places in between. And whether we're dealing with mechanical systems or electrical systems, it doesn't matter. Very, very rarely is there a zero or a one. How do we teach the next generation of folks that a lot of the answers we're looking for are in between the zero and the one? Feedback in systems, the entire world, everything that engineering has built over the last several thousand years is based upon the simple principle of feedback. Feedback is used to control things so that they do not get chaotic or out of control. Up on the right, that is a mechanical governor built for steam engines back in the 18th century. Very simple, designed to keep trains from running out of control. The electrical circuit in the lower left is the single most important circuit in every electronic device on the planet. It keeps things from running out of control. In the world of cybersecurity, we are not trained to think that way. We're just trained to put in your RJ cables, and if it works, we're good. But from a system standpoint, we invite failure, and we've all seen those kinds of failures. In the world of ICS, Industrial Control Systems, and SCADA, feedback is a significant component of keeping huge industrial systems from going out of control. Yet in our world, we tend to ignore it. We have not used it enough, and I'm suggesting that this becomes part of some level of training for the next generations and continuing education of professionals today. We're going small. We're getting really, really tiny. I mean, sometimes it is absolutely amazing to be able to see what can be done. As soon as somebody builds it, somebody then will sell it, somebody then will distribute it, will deploy it, and then we as an industry are going to have to deal with the security implications. Versus having pieces of our industry, enough people fluent in to be able to discuss, in this case, nanotechnologies, optical CPUs, the various types of human mechanical interfaces as in the lower left. These are going to become standard things. Look at the picture on the lower left with the lady with the prosthetic arm. How many ways are there to be hostile to that particular lady with that particular prosthetic on her arm? Well, there's an awful lot of them, but do we design things with those in mind? In our industry, we don't train people to think that way. In our world, we assume that everything is going to be a binary answer. It's a yes or a no, and that's just absolutely not true. And again, my pitch at the end with my book is security is probabilistic. It is never absolute. There never will be perfect security or a one. There never will be a zero of security unless the systems are completely unplugged. Everything else is in the middle, and it is all probabilistic. And now that we know how to quantify security, we know the mathematics of security, we need to get this piece of the education handed over and part of the curriculum so that when people are designing systems, they can start to understand where weaknesses are probabilistically, and that helps evaluate and coordinate with risk. because risk of an event, risk of behavior, risk of tolerance of a system to perform, tied together with the trust level of how much do you trust a person, a thing, an object, a code, a networking relationship. These are all probabilistic, and we can measure them, and we know how to measure security using these approaches, and we can come exceedingly close to the correct answers. We're moving into quantum. How many people today even speak the basics of quantum? What does it mean? What does it mean to us? Does it matter? Are the claims that are coming out in the quantum world, are they real or are they more bullshit? We can get into those discussions anytime. I'm not a huge fan right now for various reasons, but at least have in our discipline some conversational fluencies in this. AI. I've been giving a lot of talks on AI recently, and I talk to people in my industry, and they have virtually no understanding of the basics of AI, deep learning, machine learning. And it takes a fair amount of time to actually go in and learn it. And I've spent about 3 years doing it now and been able to find out why AI is not going to work for security, why the vendors that are selling AI are generally full of shit, why the false promises are worse than not having it at all. But again, how do we talk to people in our industry that don't have the basics to be able to understand the technology so that we can fairly discuss these implications versus leaving it to a handful of vendors who all say, trust me. And that has been part of the problem of our industry for the last 40, 45 years. And all I'm saying is that this should be part and parcel of part of the education in schools and in continuing education for our world. Fractals. How long is the coastline of England? The answer is, how big is your yardstick? Is it a small one? Is it a big one? The answers absolutely differ. They differ significantly by orders of magnitude. And everything in nature, every single network has fractal components. So we can apply, again, the mathematics of fractals if we know how to ask the right question. I'm not going to get all crazy here, but it's interesting that the Carrington effect from 1859, which shut down the entire globe's telegraph system, was because of a solar flare, a CME, coronal mass ejection. Could that happen again? Unfortunately, yes, but the planet has very few plans for such an event, and getting sent back to the Stone Age is not on most people's wish list. But if we don't do something about it and understand how to protect ourselves against it, we'll have 3 days warning before one comes. And there are ways to protect the majority or large number of our systems. Again, different sorts of study and expertise. The second area that we need to have our education tuned up for and our workforce tuned up for is history. We keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over. You've seen it in companies when you move from one to another. You've seen it with the new next generation products. It's still the same old stuff, just with now it has a nice, pretty red bow on it. We cannot keep doing this, and the failure is not teaching enough history. There are some brilliant, brilliant people who have an effect on our industry, scientists for hundreds of years. We know a great deal of what does not work. In our field, we know a lot of what does not work. Yet, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and history would hopefully help. We don't teach much about computer history, about where all this technology came from, or that until 1984, the vast majority of the computing industry was run by women. Then in 1984, that all changed. Take a look at it. The history of technology, of way we think about things. I give talks in public, and I was very shocked. Last year, I was giving a talk to a well-educated, good engineering group, and I said, All right, how many of you know the basic Shannon's information theory? And not one hand in the audience of 300 people went up. All right, how many of you know Shannon? Not one hand. Any of you know information theory? Not one hand went up. Our industry is based upon information theory. Every single bit of it is based upon the work of Shannon and von Neumann from the 1930s and 1940s. That's where things work. That's where things fall apart. Yet our own professionals have no idea the importance of understanding Shannon, von Neumann, in order to be able to work through problems and help design networks with security in mind. And that is our fault. The computer security history goes back thousands of years. You can go back to crypto efforts way back in Roman times, Egyptian times. You can go to computer security if you look at it from a deception standpoint. You can go back 5,000 years. Using deceptive techniques is core of military and security history. Yet we don't teach any of that. Women, I mentioned that. This is where we were, and now with the inclusion effort and the feelings of inequality between the sexes in our field, we have a long way to come because it used to be all about the women. Military history is about conflict. We don't teach enough of this. Massification in conventional warfare for thousands of years. There's a new movie coming out next year with Benedict Cumberbatch called The War Magician, and it's about the Masculines, a British family of magicians who helped the Brits win 2 wars. The fundamentals of military conflict, of how the conflicts are waged, how they're planned out at the strategic level, at the tactical level, we lose all of this when we want to employ concepts, for example, of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. These are crucial to how we need to be protecting our networks instead of doing it in stasis all by itself. The OODA loop, if you take nothing else away from this, study OODA loops and look at how important they are to continuing a security process. In this case, the OODA loop, and you can do this in many ways, is all about understanding your environment, your situational awareness, whether it is the anthro, the cyber, or the kinetic. The principle is identical. Yet again, we don't teach that the human component, the cyber component, and the physical component are all just different ways of looking at a security universe through a slightly different lens. Ultimately, all the way up at the meta level, they are identical and can be designed for together or in isolation. Ultimately, the OODA loops were designed to survive combat in a dogfight with military aircraft. And the answer was, he who observes, orients, decides, and acts faster will win, and the other guy's going to die. That's just the way the mathematics and it all works out. And this has been now a doctrine for almost 40 years. In the world of cybersecurity, the same rules apply. When you apply the mathematics of analog network security, it becomes exceedingly clear that the cyber or physical or human component in any conflict, he who is faster wins. And from a defensive standpoint, this means that we have to incredibly speed up our detection and reaction remediation times in order to be able to start getting ahead of our adversaries. Again, unfortunately, we're not teaching this because it comes from a different discipline. It doesn't come from cybersecurity. OODA loops come from the military. We have a great deal to learn and move over this knowledge base and apply it in our field. I promised a little bit of porn, just very pretty cables. Next, nonlinearity. Excuse me. We tend to think very linear, go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and explain things very, very clearly all along the way. Where true inspiration comes from is nonlinearity. suddenly that inspiration, that idea that came out of nowhere. Well, I don't know where that came from, but wow, that might work. Trying things that are new and not part of a traditional systemic process. We need to ingratiate and bring more people with this type of ability into our field. The third piece of the educational triad that we really need to get people up to speed on to understand is what I call humanity. It's the human component. I refer to anthro-cyber-kinetics as being the new world. Well, cyberkinetics is robots, it's drones, it's anything that we, anything that we tie together, a physical system and an electronic system is cyberkinetic. When we add humans to the equation, then it becomes anthro-cyber-kinetic. And how much about these areas are we actually teaching or wanting our cybersecurity experts, CISO, C-suite, management people to actually understand? Because when it comes down to it, every time a computer is useful, it means it has to have an interaction with a human being. And unless we include humans in the equations, whether it's the mathematical equations or the philosophical equations of how we're interacting with these devices, how we are making decisions, and how they influence us and we influence them, we're going to continue down the road of, for example, excuse me, roughly 92% of all successful network attacks and APTs begin with an attack upon the human being through some form of social engineering, whether it's technical social engineering or not. It all begins with the human being. Every interaction is. So how come we're not teaching the latest and greatest thinking in this field as it grows? Part of this comes down to failure. It's a fear of failure. When you walk into the HR lady, do you say to her, "Hi, I want to work here, and I have never made a mistake in my entire life. And everything I've done is technically perfect. No mistakes. Nope, never." Or do you want the person that comes in and says, "Boy, you know, in the last 15 years, I've had 38 major systemic meltdowns. We were able to save 36 of them. 2 of them went to complete hell in a handbasket, and here's what I learned." What do you want defending your organization? Hopefully somebody that has experience, because failure teaches you ultimately more than success. And any endeavor from engineering to sports knows this very, very well. What's the purpose of the brain? Predict the future. That is it. What's the purpose of computers? Predict the future. Yet we're not conflating them. We're thinking of them as very different, yet they become, as we learn more about neuroscience, more and more the same. They are not. The human brain is not binary. It is malleable. Our memory circuits are just terrifically awful. Yet we don't design and treat our security or our systems to match what the human person, what he really is, and what his capabilities and failures are. When it comes to our senses, we have roughly 23 different senses. We think of them as 5 or 6, depending upon your belief systems. But we fundamentally have 23. And this is about detection and depth. And in our world, do we employ true detection and depth? Well, we sort of do, maybe in a couple of areas in the mechanical engineering world. But in the cyber world, we don't do nearly enough detection. And we rely upon the human to be the human firewall. You're the ultimate defense. Only you can help protect our organization. Well, if we're using that as a philosophy for training and security awareness, then we ought to be educating people more as well. This is a perfect example of detection and depth. This is an engine 787, and it has over 5,000 detection points built into it, sampling the environment every single second, generating over 400 terabytes of information on a transatlantic flight. What does that do? What we want is those 5,000 detectors to predict the future. We want them to know that perhaps a piece of metal might be a little bit fatiguing, and while it's not really critical right now, we're going to monitor it more carefully, and then have it checked out when it's down on the ground. Remember, we as humans, computers, and detection reaction systems are all about predicting the future. And the engineers behind engines of this type, in my opinion, are magnificent and the epitome of designing to avoid failure mode, or at least be able to predict it. Multisensory filtering. The human brain does an incredible job. We look at this and we can kind of fog over. When you're on the internet, how many of you actually see and pay attention to all of the ads? I guess I'm blind to an awful lot of them, but the brain has the ability to do filtering, which means that the brain has also the ability for incredible focus. Do we design our systems using the psychological understandings of neuroscience in mind? No, we have failed miserably to include that in our engineering. The brain is really malleable. A computer's brain is really not. AI is not what they claim it to be at all. But the brain is incredibly malleable. And that means that the technology can affect it in good ways. It can affect it in bad ways. When we look at social media, massive millions, billions of people are addicted to it because it is a drug distribution system. Part of the neuroplasticity of the brain is to look for dopamine fixes, the feel-good drug. And every time somebody gets a like on Facebook, they get a little zap of dopamine. So when we see social media addiction, the technology, we did not understand all of this when social media began 15 years ago. We kind of saw, we intuitively knew that people liked to have good relationships with people, hopefully, but we didn't understand exactly what the neurochemical processes are. We do now. Our designers, our security people should have some conversational fluency in what all of this means to the security of a system. Perception up in the upper left, that's really a disturbing image, and it is not wiggling, it's actually very fixed, but it's designed to mess with your eyes. Perception is incredibly important because we all see things slightly differently. I'm colorblind, so I have real disadvantage in many cases. But because people's perception is so different, do we design security in mind with humans and how they may or may not perceive the world differently? There are about 12% of people find this image ridiculously disturbing. And that's just a straw man poll from talks over the years. And it's because of how we perceive things differently. So when we're designing our security and we want the humans to be helpful with the security of our enterprise, are we doing it with any sort of perception and neuroscience in mind? Unfortunately, no. One of the great things you could do is just go out and get a copy of this book. I think it's under 100 pages, written in England about a little over 130 years ago. And it describes a world of two-dimensional creatures interfacing with a 3D world. And from a perceptual standpoint, I really suggest you read this. It is a brilliant way to start to understand different types of perceptions. And then if you want, you can go on to flatter land, space land, and there's different versions of this that take it up into higher dimensions. How about influencing people? When we are running, whether it's a security program, an IT program, an application, we often want to influence people's behaviors, whether it's a customer's behavior to buy, a security person's desire to influence their users to behave correctly. We understand influence a lot more than we ever did with the advances of neuroscience. And just in the last 2 years, the amount of ability to be able to target and offer levels of prediction of the results of how to do influence. Think of it from a security awareness standpoint, thinking of it from getting your CEOs and C-level people to be able to actually be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. How do we influence them? We understand the physics. We understand the neuroscience now. And art. Art is about telling stories. Art history is about telling stories visually. We are storytellers. That is the nature of us as human beings. And that is how we influence people, is to find a compelling story. And part of that is about the old mantra, show, don't tell. Typically in the anthro-cyber-kinetic world, whether we're designing, building, whether we're user base, that's often why you hear people say, well, how do I do this? Well, go to YouTube. It'll show you. Show, don't tell. Use less words, use more visuals, and that's all part of fundamental communications. Can the uber geeks talk to the C-suite and the board members or investors? Mostly not. Can the C-suite communicate effectively with their uber geeks? Not very well is the typical answer. We need to increase the amount of communication skills between the various members of our organizations, because hopefully we're still all on the same page with the same goals to improve it. And these types of simple awareness and training on the human element of all of this is critical. Using feedback is, again, a mechanism. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. When it comes to training people in systems, training people in behavior, studies back from Ebbinghaus in the 1860s, we know exactly how long it takes people to learn, how long it takes people to forget, and how to manipulate that. We know these things. Do you? Does your C-suite? Do your training people? Do the people that are building the networks understand this to enough of a depth to be able to design it with something conscious in mind, with an end result? And unfortunately, I don't see it very often. We've got ethics that we're going to be dealing with, and the trolley problem. If you've never studied the trolley problem, just go do a Google on it, and it'll take you to Wiki. And there's some severe ethical issues that become important when we're designing the security and failure mode of cyberkinetic systems. For example, an automated car is driving down the street. It goes haywire, something goes wrong. It's facing a life and death situation, and somebody is going to get hurt. Somebody might get killed. How do we program our environment, our technology, to be ethically correct and pick the right person to die? Is it possible? This is all part of where we're going with anthro-cyber-kinetic systems. As we glue them all together, do we have any ethical base, any understanding of the humanity component of it, so that do we make those ethical decisions? Do we hand it over to AI? And that opens up an entirely new set of questions with the problems that we have with AI. The ethical questions in these systems are profound indeed. I've always been a believer in doing triads and doing sets of three. Nature is built on three. Triangles are stronger than squares. Tetrahedrons are stronger than pyramids. Threes are the fundamental component by which we end up with the work of synergy of Buckminster Fuller, strong engineering principles. When you look at designs and crossbars of buildings, they're done in triangular shapes for very, very profound types of engineering reasons. Same thing from a thinking standpoint. Humans are conditioned to be able to think in threes. Sex, drug, rock and roll. Three men walk into a bar, jokes, storytelling. It's always about threes, because that is the natural rhythm, cadence of we as human beings. And some people say, well, you got to have 8 main reasons. No, you need 3. Figure it out. If you can't bring it down to 3, you don't know what you're doing. But getting threes working together absolutely works. Then again, you run across other folks who go, well, I've been doing security a long time, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and there's more data breaches, and the criminals are getting better, and I don't have enough budget. And you hear all of these incredible complaints. Cybersecurity is just too damned hard. Well, you have a choice. You have a choice. You can either believe that and accept it, take your paycheck and retire in a few years and be done with it. Or we take moonshots, landing on the moon. 64 kilobits of memory. It was a huge gamble. The Manhattan Project. All of these projects that are over here were profoundly life-changing. Is cybersecurity too hard? And I argue no, because, well, hell, we found the math for it. We understand the math, and we're publishing all of the details on the mathematics of security, whether it includes humans, cyber systems, or kinetic systems, or gluing them all together. We now do have the math on that. Here's my pitch. There's the name of the book. Those are the chapters. It is a gorgeous book that involves all of these principles we've talked about from a standpoint of looking at them at security through different lenses. And this is part of what taught me what we're missing in cybersecurity education, ongoing education, communication at different layers and skill sets within an organization. That's what really taught me what we're missing going on. And on that note, I want to thank everybody for listening. I'm here to answer as many questions as we might have time for. And I'm going to hand it back to Artie. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Win, for delivering this very interesting and insightful webinar. It was great hearing your story from way back and link it with the transitional phases that this industry went through. On that note, I want also to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27032 Cybersecurity Elite Implementer course. A PCB certificate on these courses will convey your dedication in implementing and managing cybersecurity processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now, we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. The first question is, what are the special skills that one needs to succeed as a cybersecurity expert?
I think that the overriding, the biggest one is curiosity, flexibility, and recognizing that the more you learn, the less you know. I know that after 40 years of doing security, there are moments that I have no idea what's going on. It's impossible, absolutely impossible. And that's what led us to do all of the mathematical work to define security. But ultimately, you got to be curious, and you got to get out of any box, get rid of preconceived notions, and then ultimately be willing to try something new and suffer the fools. If people make fun of you for trying something new, I think the joke's on them. Be open. Give it a go, and don't listen to people's bullshit.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the top cybersecurity concern that we face today?
Apathy, arrogance, and ignorance. People ask me that question a lot, and they expect a technical answer, and it isn't. It's the apathy of people who say, it'll never happen to me. Nobody wants my information. I have nothing of value. That's apathy, and then that brings into the ignorance of no, I don't care. It really doesn't matter. The ignorance of the way that technology profoundly affects us all. And then there's the arrogance of, it'll never happen to me. Oh, no, we're fine. We're secure. We have everything all taken care of. No worries. And it's those three human characteristics that have generated almost every single serious data breach in the last 30 years.
Thank you. Now, because of the time limitation, we will conclude the presentation with a rather interesting question. So, which is more correct to say, information security part of cybersecurity or the other way around?
Oh boy, I like that. That is a bar question. There's no simple answer to that. I think a lot of that is definitions. Is information independent of cyber? Well, if it's on paper, yeah. If it's in electronic form, no. So I think I would put information, and I will include in that word data. because are we talking data? Are we talking information? Are we talking intelligence? What do we mean by that word? But I think it's a great question, and there has been some work done on defining those things. I personally try to stay out of those debates because it doesn't help me understand the terrain that I'm dealing with in quote unquote cybersecurity. I know I'm dancing around that, but I don't see, it's not a simple answer, and I'd love to run into you at a conference somewhere and have a beer and discuss it.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne, once again for this outstanding session. I hope the audience had the chance to learn some quite useful things, and I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like also to inform you that this session will be recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. For more information about our webinars, please visit our website www.becb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.